Welcome, dreamers. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most captivating, most debated, and most enduringly mysterious stories the human mind has ever encountered. A story that has outlasted empires, survived the collapse of civilizations, and continued to whisper its name into the ears of philosophers, explorers, poets, and seekers across more than 2,000 years of recorded history. Settle in. Let the weight of the world lift away from your shoulders. Let your breath slow and deepen. There is no rush here. Only the long, quiet drift into story and knowledge and wonder. Tonight, we are going to travel somewhere that may or may not have ever existed. We are going to walk the gilded streets of a civilization so advanced, so powerful, and so achingly beautiful that when it fell, the ocean itself swallowed it whole, leaving behind nothing but memory, myth, and an echo that has never fully gone quiet. We are going to explore the entire history of Atlantis. From the first moment those words were written down on a scroll in ancient Athens, to the philosophers who debated what they meant, to the explorers who sailed half the world searching for sunken ruins, to the scientists and archaeologists who argue about it even now. This is the full, rich, sprawling story of the most famous lost civilization in all of human imagination. So close your eyes for just a moment. Picture the sea at night. The water is dark and impossibly deep. Somewhere far beneath the surface, beyond the reach of any diver, beyond the reach of any light, there is a place that people have been dreaming about for over 2,000 years. Let's go find it together. To understand Atlantis, you have to understand the world it came from. And the world it came from was ancient Greece in the 4th century before the Common Era, a world that was in many ways just as complicated, just as uncertain, and just as obsessed with its own past as we are today. It was a world that had recently survived something catastrophic. 50 years before Plato was born, the Persian Empire, the largest political entity the ancient world had ever seen, sent its armies across the sea to conquer Greece. And Greece, fractured and squabbling among itself, somehow managed to push them back. The Battle of Marathon in 490 before the Common Era, the naval victory at Salamis in 480, the land stand at Thermopylae, these were not just military events. They were defining moments of identity. They became the stories that Greeks told about themselves, about what it meant to be Greek, about what virtue looked like in the face of overwhelming power. Athens, in particular, emerged from the Persian Wars convinced of something, that it was special, that it had been chosen, or had chosen itself, as the defender of civilization against barbarism, of democracy against despotism, of reason against brute force. And for several decades after those wars, Athens enjoyed what historians would later call its golden age, the time of Pericles, of Socrates, of Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, of the Parthenon being built high on the Acropolis against a blazing Mediterranean sky. But by the time Plato was a young man, the golden age was over. Athens had thrown away its advantage in the catastrophic Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a conflict that dragged on for nearly 3 decades and ended in Athenian defeat. The democracy that Athens had championed executed its own greatest philosopher, Socrates, in 399 before the Common Era. Plato watched his teacher die, forced to drink hemlock because the democratic assembly feared his influence on the young. The world that produced Plato was a world in crisis. And Plato, sitting with all of that grief and all of that disillusionment, began to write. He wrote about justice, about the ideal state, about the nature of the soul. He wrote dialogues, conversations between characters that explored the deepest questions a person could ask. And somewhere in that restless, brilliant, philosophically turbulent mind, the idea of Atlantis began to take shape. Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era was a city of roughly 30,000 to 40,000 citizens, surrounded by a larger population of women, slaves, and non-citizens who could not vote but who formed the backbone of daily life. The agora, the open marketplace at the heart of the city, was where ideas were traded as freely as goods. Men walked and argued, teachers gathered students under colonnades, the air smelled of salt from the nearby port of Piraeus and of smoke from sacrifices at the Acropolis above. Plato founded his academy around 387 before the Common Era, not long after his travels to Sicily, where he had tried and failed to turn a tyrant into a philosopher king. The academy was a grove of olive trees just outside the city walls, dedicated to the hero Academus, and it became the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato would teach there for the rest of his life. His students included Aristotle, who would go on to teach Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer much of the known world. So when Plato wrote about Atlantis, he was not writing in a vacuum. He was writing with purpose, with political awareness, and with a deep understanding of how stories shape the way people understand themselves and their world. It is critical to hold on to this context as we move forward, because everything about Atlantis, every detail, every implication, every resonance flows out of this single, remarkable mind and the turbulent world that shaped it. The story of Atlantis first appears in 2 of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. These were written around 360 before the Common Era, near the end of Plato's long life, when he was in his late 60s or early 70s. They are among the most studied philosophical texts ever written, and they contain, embedded within their larger arguments about cosmology and politics, the only ancient account of Atlantis that has ever been found. Let's start with the Timaeus. The dialogue is set on the day after a longer conversation about the ideal state, a conversation very much like the one Plato records in his famous work, The Republic. The speakers are Socrates, who is Plato's usual mouthpiece, Timaeus, a philosopher and astronomer from the city of Locri in southern Italy, Hermocrates, a Sicilian statesman, and Critias, an Athenian aristocrat. The setting is intimate, a small group of educated men gathered for a conversation that will range from the nature of the universe to the origins of humanity. Socrates opens by expressing a desire. He has spent the previous day describing the ideal state, a just city governed by reason, defended by virtuous guardians. Now he wants to see that ideal city in action. He wants, he says, to see it at war. He wants a story. And Critias obligingly says he has one. What follows is one of the most famous passages in all of ancient literature. Critias explains that he heard the story from his grandfather, also named Critias, who had heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, and Solon, one of the great lawgivers of the ancient world, a man of historical fact who genuinely lived in the 6th century before the Common Era, had heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. According to Critias, when Solon visited Sais, the local priests told him something extraordinary. They told him that Athens was the oldest of all cities, even older than the Egyptians' own ancient civilization, and that Athens had once performed a deed of spectacular valor that had been forgotten in Greece itself, erased by the many floods and catastrophes that periodically wiped human memory clean. The priests, they said, kept records going back thousands of years, and those records preserved a story that the Greeks had lost. 9,000 years before Solon's time, the priests told him, which would place the events roughly 11,500 years before our present day. A mighty empire had arisen in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules was the ancient Greek name for what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa where the Mediterranean Sea opens into the vast Atlantic. Beyond those pillars, in the open ocean, there was an island, an enormous island, larger, the priests said, than Libya and Asia combined. An island they called Atlantis. Critias does not go into enormous detail in the Timaeus. That fuller account comes in the dialogue named after him. But he establishes the essential facts. Atlantis was a great empire. It had extended its dominion across much of the world, controlling parts of Europe and Africa up to the borders of Egypt and Tyrrhenia. And then it had attempted the ultimate conquest. It had sent its armies to swallow all of Europe and all of Asia in a single, overwhelming campaign. Standing in its way was Athens. The Athenians, alone among the Greeks, had refused to submit. They had fought back, and when their allies abandoned them, when they were left utterly alone against an empire that dwarfed anything they had faced before, the Athenians had still refused to yield. They fought and they won. They pushed back the Atlantean forces, liberated the peoples who had been enslaved, and saved civilization itself. And then, shortly after this Athenian victory, as if the gods themselves had decided the story was over, disaster struck. In a single day and a single night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, Athens lost its warrior class, swallowed by the earth. And Atlantis, the entire island, all those cities, all those people, all that gold, sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean without a trace. That is the Timaeus account. It is brief, almost offhand, as if Critias is summarizing a longer story he will tell in full later. And indeed, in the dialogue called Critias, the story gets much, much richer. The Critias dialogue is where Atlantis truly comes alive. It is incomplete. It breaks off mid-sentence, suggesting either that Plato never finished it or that part of the text was lost in antiquity. But what survives is remarkable in its detail, its specificity, and its vividness. It reads less like a philosophical argument and more like a story, with geography and architecture and history given in loving, precise detail that has fascinated readers for more than 2 millennia. The narrative begins at the very beginning, with the gods, when the gods divided the earth among themselves. Long ago in the mythological past, Poseidon received the island of Atlantis as his portion. Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of earthquakes, shaker of the earth, took possession of this great island in the middle of the ocean, and there he found a mortal woman named Cleito. Cleito lived on a hill near the center of the island with her father, Evenor, and her mother, Leucippe. Her parents had died by the time Poseidon found her, and the god fell deeply, powerfully in love with her. He enclosed the hill where she lived within concentric rings of water and land, alternating circles of sea and earth, to protect her and to make the place where they would live together into something extraordinary, something that no ordinary human could easily reach or breach. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 pairs of male twins together. 10 sons who became the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest of the firstborn twins was named Atlas, and it was for him that both the island and the surrounding ocean were named. The second of the firstborn twins was named Gadeirus in the Greek text, which Plato notes corresponds to the name Gadir in the Phoenician tongue, a place that would later be known as Cadiz, on the southwestern coast of Spain. This geographical detail would prove tantalizing to later scholars. Atlas received dominion over the greatest and most fertile portion of the island, including the hill at its center, and his lineage would rule Atlantis for countless generations. His brothers were given portions of the island and islands nearby, and they all ruled as kings under the sovereignty of Atlas and his descendants. Now Plato begins to describe the island itself, and the description is so specific that it almost reads like a surveyor's report. The island, according to the Critias, was bounded by the sea on all sides and contained within it a great plain, described as the most beautiful and fertile plain in the world. This plain was rectangular, or nearly so, 3,000 stades in length and 2,000 stades in breadth. A stade was a Greek unit of measurement, roughly equivalent to 600 feet, or about 185 meters. So the Great Plain of Atlantis, by these numbers, would have been roughly 550 kilometers long and 370 kilometers wide, an enormous agricultural heartland. The entire plain was protected by a great canal that encircled it, and a network of smaller canals and channels that brought water from the mountains to the fields and allowed ships to travel inland. The engineering described is breathtaking in its ambition, a system of waterways that would have required the labor of tens of thousands of people across many generations to construct. At the center of the island, at the location of that original hill where Poseidon had found Crete, was the capital city. And this capital city was something else entirely. The concentric rings of water and land that Poseidon had originally created around Creto's hill had been expanded and elaborated by successive generations of Atlantean kings. By the time the story reaches its climax, the capital city consists of an innermost island, about 5 stades in diameter, roughly 900 meters across, surrounded by alternating rings of water and land. The first ring of water was 3 stades wide, then a ring of land 1 stade wide, then another ring of water 4 stades wide, then another ring of land 2 stades wide, and finally an outermost ring of water 3 stades wide, beyond which began the outer harbor and the great canal connecting the city to the sea. To give a sense of scale, the outermost ring of water alone would have been about 550 meters wide. The entire complex of rings taken together would have had an outer diameter of roughly 27 stades, approximately 5 kilometers across. This was not a hill with a village on it. This was a colossal urban complex, geometric in its precision, breathtaking in its conception. The rings of land were connected by tunnels large enough for a trireme, an ancient warship, to pass through. The tunnels had enormous gates and towers guarding them. The outermost ring connected to the sea by a vast canal 1 stade wide and 100 feet deep, capable of admitting the largest ships of the age. Within this concentric ring city, every surface gleamed with precious materials. The innermost island, the Acropolis, the sacred heart of the city, was surrounded by a wall plated in gold. Within that wall stood temples and palaces and sacred gardens. The most important structure was the Temple of Poseidon himself, a building of spectacular proportions, 1 stade long, 300 feet wide, and proportionally tall, covered on the outside with silver, with pinnacles of gold. The roof was ivory inlaid with gold, silver, and orichalcum. Orichalcum. This is one of the most intriguing details in the entire Critias. Plato describes orichalcum as a metal that was next in value only to gold, and which Atlantis possessed in great abundance, mining it from the earth throughout the island. It gleamed, he says, like fire. It was used to coat the innermost wall of the capital city, so that the entire circumference of the sacred center shone with a reddish gold glow that could be seen from the sea. The word orichalcum comes from the Greek words for mountain and copper, and there has been vigorous debate ever since about what it actually was. Some scholars think it was simply a particularly beautiful alloy of copper, perhaps brass or a high-quality bronze. Others have suggested it was a naturally occurring mineral, perhaps a form of amber, or a volcanic mineral with unusual optical properties. In 2015, a team of divers off the coast of Sicily found a shipwreck dating to approximately the 6th century before the Common Era, and among the cargo were 28 ingots of an unusual metal alloy, zinc, copper, lead, iron, and nickel, that some researchers claimed might be the legendary orichalcum. The debate has never been fully settled. Within the temple of Poseidon stood a colossal golden statue of the god himself, shown in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 Nereids, sea nymphs, riding on dolphins. The statue was so tall that its head nearly touched the roof of the temple. Around it, the wives and concubines of the 10 Atlantean kings had dedicated golden statues of themselves, adding to the overwhelming sense of divine magnificence. Outside the temple was a sacred grove of trees, springs of both hot and cold water that fed bathhouses for the kings, their servants, and the public, and elaborate gardens and race courses. The descriptions are so specific. The hot and cold springs, the stone used for the walls, red, white, and black stone quarried from within the rings of land, the timber used for the structures, that they read less like imaginative embellishment and more like the kind of detail that appears in ancient histories when a writer is trying to convey something that actually existed. The outer rings of the city were densely populated. The land rings were covered with houses, workshops, and harbors. The outermost canal connecting the city to the open sea was lined with docks and warehouses. The harbor was perpetually crowded with merchant ships from all over the world, and the noise and bustle never ceased, day or night. At night, the city glowed. Beyond the capital, the Great Plain was divided into 60,000 parcels of land, each one allocated to a family that was obligated to provide a certain number of soldiers and equipment to the Atlantean army in times of war. The mountains to the north of the plain were described as towering and beautiful, filled with rivers and lakes and forests, and home to wealthy villages and farms. The military power of Atlantis was staggering. From the plain alone, the Atlantean army could muster 10,000 chariots, 60,000 horse soldiers, 120,000 heavy infantrymen, 160,000 light infantrymen, and 240,000 archers and slingers. The navy numbered 1,200 warships and their full complement of sailors and marines. These numbers are so enormous that they seem almost mythological. And indeed, no ancient army actually operated at this scale, but they serve their narrative purpose. They establish Atlantis as an almost incomprehensibly powerful military machine. And all of this power, all of this wealth, all of this engineered magnificence, it all derived, in Plato's telling, from the original divine inheritance of Poseidon, multiplied by generations of Atlantean industry and cleverness. The island was naturally abundant. It produced food in enormous quantities, supported vast herds of livestock including elephants, and was rich in metals and timber and every kind of plant and animal. The Atlanteans did not have to scratch and struggle for their prosperity. It came easily, abundantly, as a kind of divine gift. And that is precisely the problem, because the Critias also tells us what happened to the Atlanteans over those long generations, and it is not a happy story. In the early days, Plato tells us, the Atlanteans were noble. They carried within them a generous portion of divine nature, the legacy of Poseidon's blood, and this divine nature expressed itself in wisdom, in virtue, in a serene contempt for wealth and power. They ruled their vast empire with justice and benevolence. They were, in the truest sense, a good people. But as the generations passed, as the divine portion of their nature was slowly diluted by intermarriage with ordinary mortals, something changed. The human part of them began to dominate. They became greedy. They became proud. They began to value wealth and power above virtue. They lost their capacity for true happiness, which Plato believed could only come from virtue, and mistook the glittering accumulation of gold and orichalcum and tribute and conquest for the real thing. They began to behave, in other words, exactly like an imperial power drunk on its own success. Sound familiar? This is the philosophical heart of the Atlantis story, and it is crucial to understanding what Plato was actually doing. He was not writing a travelogue or a historical chronicle. He was writing a moral fable, or at the very least, a story with deep moral implications. The fall of Atlantis is, at its core, a story about what happens when a civilization loses sight of the things that actually matter, when it trades virtue for power, wisdom for wealth, justice for conquest. Zeus, watching from Olympus, saw what had become of Poseidon's descendants. He decided it was time to act. He called together all the gods, a council of the divine, and began to speak. And here, at this critical juncture, the Critias breaks off. The text simply ends. Whether Plato never finished it, whether a third dialogue he planned, which would have been called Hermocrates, was never written, or whether part of the manuscript was lost at some point in antiquity, we do not know. The Council of the Gods, Zeus's speech, the divine decision to destroy Atlantis, all of it vanishes into silence. But from the brief account in the Timaeus, we know what happens next. In a single day and a single night, Atlantis is consumed by earthquakes and floods. The sea reclaims it. Every trace disappears beneath the waves. And as a final detail that somehow makes the whole thing feel even more ominous, the sea above where Atlantis once stood becomes impassable, choked with mud from the sunken island, making navigation impossible for a long time afterward. It is worth pausing on this image. A civilization of unimaginable power and beauty, reduced to a muddy shallows, a warning to anyone who might be tempted to mistake magnificence for virtue. A reminder that the gods are watching, and that the gods have standards. Plato's Atlantis is, in its essence, a story about Athens, not the historical Athens of Solon or Themistocles, but the ideal Athens, the Athens of Plato's imagination, the Athens that should have existed, the Athens that could have existed if it had kept its better instincts. The Atlanteans are Athens' shadow, everything Athens might become if it chose power over virtue, wealth over wisdom, empire over justice. And the ancient Athens of the story, the Athens that defeated Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, the Athens that fought alone when everyone else surrendered, the Athens that asked for nothing in return for saving civilization, that is the Athens Plato wished existed in his own time. That is the country he was writing toward. A place of courage without arrogance, strength without cruelty, greatness without corruption. In that sense, whether Atlantis was real or not, the story Plato told about it is one of the most searching and clear-eyed critiques of imperial ambition ever written. This is the question that every serious discussion of Atlantis must eventually confront. Did Plato invent the story of Atlantis entirely from his own imagination, as a literary and philosophical device? Or was he drawing on some genuine historical tradition, some folk memory, some older account, some kernel of real events that he then shaped and embellished for his own purposes? The debate has been going on, without resolution, for over 2,000 years. The case for invention, for Atlantis as pure philosophical fiction, is strong. Plato was the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, and he was also a gifted literary artist. His dialogues are full of what he himself called myths, invented stories used to illustrate philosophical points. The myth of Ir in the Republic, where a soldier dies in battle and returns to life with a vision of the afterlife. The myth of the cave, in which prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality. The myth of the charioteer, used to explain the nature of the human soul. Plato knew how to use a story to make an argument, and he did it repeatedly and brilliantly. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly. It is introduced at a moment in the Timaeus when Socrates has just described the ideal state and expressed a desire to see it in action. Critias conveniently has a story about exactly that. A story where an idealized ancient Athens performs precisely the kind of brave, virtuous, self-sacrificing action that Socrates has just been praising. It is almost too convenient. The story provides exactly the illustration Socrates was asking for, at exactly the moment he asked for it. Furthermore, many of the details in the Critias have a quality of literary invention rather than historical memory. The concentric rings of water and land are too geometrically perfect to be accidental. The numbers, the enormous plain, the vast armies, the precise measurements of the canals and walls have a schematic quality, as if they are derived from an ideal, rather than observed from life. The story of Poseidon and Cleito is explicitly mythological, and the framing device, Solon heard it from Egyptian priests who had records going back 9,000 years, is conveniently unverifiable, placing the events at a distance so vast that no contradiction is possible. Aristotle, who was Plato's own student and knew him personally, reportedly said that Plato simply invented Atlantis. The man who created it destroyed it. This attribution comes to us secondhand through later writers and scholars debate whether Aristotle actually said it, but it is significant that even in the ancient world, some people concluded that Atlantis was fiction. The case for some genuine historical kernel is harder to make but not impossible. The Egyptian city of Sais was a real place, and it did have ancient temples with genuine historical records. Solon genuinely did visit Egypt, or at least ancient tradition strongly suggests he did. The Pillars of Hercules were a real geographical marker. The general direction given for Atlantis, in the Atlantic Ocean to the west, is at least consistent with a real direction in the real world. Some scholars have pointed out that Plato goes out of his way in the Timaeus to insist that the story is true. Critias says explicitly that this is not a fictional myth but a genuine account. A strange thing, Solon, but true. This is a more insistent framing than Plato typically uses for his admitted mythological inventions. Does this mean the story is true? Not necessarily. A good storyteller knows that insisting on veracity is itself a narrative technique, but it has led some serious scholars to wonder whether Plato was working with some kind of source material, however distorted or elaborated. There is also the question of the Minoan civilization, which we will explore in depth in a later chapter. The Minoans were a real Bronze Age civilization that flourished on the island of Crete and throughout the Aegean roughly 3,500 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, and they were destroyed, or at least severely disrupted, by a catastrophic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, around 1600 before the Common Era. This eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. It created a tsunami, massive ashfall, and a collapse of the volcanic caldera that caused part of the island to sink into the sea. The parallels with Atlantis, a great maritime civilization in the Mediterranean, destroyed suddenly by geological catastrophe, are hard to dismiss, and yet the chronological problem is enormous. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, which puts it around 9600 before the Common Era, the Late Stone Age, a time when human civilization, as we understand it, had not yet developed agriculture, let alone cities, empires, navies, and concentric ring architecture. The Minoan eruption was roughly 1600 before the Common Era, about 9,000 years more recent than Plato's date. Either Plato got the date wildly wrong, or the Minoan connection is coincidence, or something more complex is going on. Some scholars, notably the Greek scholar Galanopoulos in the mid-20th century, have suggested that the dates and distances in Plato's account were accidentally multiplied by 10 at some point, perhaps in the transmission from the original Egyptian source, and that if you divide everything by 10, the dates and geography start to align much better with the Minoan world. This is a clever idea, but it relies on a hypothetical error with no direct evidence to support it. The honest answer is that we do not know whether Plato invented Atlantis, whether he was embellishing an older story, or whether he was drawing on some genuine folk memory of a real catastrophe. And in a way, that uncertainty is part of what makes the story so endlessly alive. A story you can prove is just history. A story you can disprove is just fiction. A story you can never fully resolve, that is mythology. And mythology, as human beings have known since the beginning, has a staying power that ordinary facts never quite achieve. What is fascinating, and often overlooked, is that the debate over whether Atlantis was real or fictional began essentially the moment Plato wrote about it. The ancient world did not receive Atlantis as undisputed historical fact. It argued about it, speculated about it, and interpreted it in ways that anticipate many of the debates that continue today. Aristotle, as already mentioned, seems to have regarded the story as fiction. He was skeptical of accounts that placed advanced civilizations in the remote past, and he appears to have thought Plato invented Atlantis to illustrate his philosophical points. Several later ancient writers follow Aristotle's lead, but other ancient thinkers were less dismissive. Crantor of Soli, a philosopher who lived in the generation after Plato and was one of the first commentators on the Timaeus, is said to have believed the story was genuine history. According to a later source, the writer Proclus, who lived in the 5th century of the Common Era, Crantor even claimed that Egyptian priests, when asked about the story by Greek visitors after Plato's death, confirmed that the account of Atlantis was recorded in their temple inscriptions. This is a remarkable claim, and it may well be apocryphal, but it shows that the tradition of Atlantis as real history is at least as old as the tradition of Atlantis as philosophical fiction. Posidonius, a Greek philosopher and historian of the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, a man of wide learning whose works survive mostly in fragments, believed that the Atlantic Ocean genuinely contained submerged landmasses and connected this belief to Plato's account. He was not the only ancient writer to imagine that the world beyond the Pillars of Hercules was full of unknown lands. Strabo, the great Greek geographer of the 1st century before the Common Era, recorded Posidonius's views while clearly skeptical himself. He seems to have thought Atlantis was a literary device, though he acknowledged the possibility that Plato had some basis in older accounts. Pliny the Elder, the Roman polymath of the 1st century of the Common Era, mentions in his Natural History that large portions of land had been swallowed by the sea, citing both specific historical events he knew about and the general phenomenon of geological change. He does not specifically name Atlantis in this context, but the cultural framework for believing in sunken lands was clearly present in the Roman world. The philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, is fascinated by Solon and devotes an entire biography to him in his famous Lives. In that biography, he mentions Solon's visit to Egypt and the story of Atlantis, noting that Solon apparently began to write an epic poem about the story, but never finished it. Plutarch seems genuinely uncertain whether to believe the story, and his account adds a poignant detail that Solon was so struck by the Egyptian account that he felt it was a great shame the story was not better known in Greece. The Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century of the Common Era, devoted enormous energy to commenting on the Timaeus and took the Atlantis story very seriously. He collected other ancient accounts of islands in the Atlantic, and he described a writer named Marcellus, otherwise unknown, who reportedly described islands in the outer ocean beyond Europe where the memory of the great Atlantean kingdom was still preserved. Whether this Marcellus was reporting genuine tradition or elaborating on Plato, we cannot say. What all of this tells us is that Atlantis was part of the intellectual atmosphere of the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries after Plato wrote. It was discussed, debated, incorporated into broader speculations about geography and history. It was neither universally accepted nor universally dismissed. It existed in that fascinating middle zone where the genuinely uncertain lives, where curiosity and imagination have free rein. The Roman world's attitude toward Atlantis is also shaped by the simple geographic fact that by the late Republican and early imperial period, Roman navigators and traders were moving into the Atlantic, passing through the Pillars of Hercules and trading as far north as Britain and as far south as West Africa. The Atlantic Ocean was becoming less mysterious, its edges more defined, and the Atlantis of Plato's account, a continent-sized island in the middle of this ocean, was not being found. The ocean was wide, but not impossibly wide. Sailors were crossing it regularly, at least along its edges. No sunken continent announced itself. This growing geographical knowledge made it increasingly difficult in the Roman world to place Atlantis where Plato said it was. The Atlantic was not filled with sunken continents. It was just very large and, beyond a certain point, unexplored. That unexplored beyond would continue to shelter Atlantis for another 1,000 years until European sailors finally crossed it and found something else entirely on the other side. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era, the fate of Plato's works in Western Europe became precarious. Much of the ancient literary and philosophical inheritance was lost or forgotten in the West during the early medieval period. The Timaeus unusually survived, or at least a portion of it survived, in a Latin translation by a writer named Chalcidius, who translated roughly the first 2/3 of the dialogue in the 4th century of the Common Era. This Chalcidius translation, with its extensive commentary, was one of the most widely read philosophical texts in the early medieval period in Western Europe. But the section of the Timaeus that contains the Atlantis account, the section near the beginning of the dialogue, was included in Chalcidius's translation. And so, throughout the so-called Dark Ages of Western Europe, educated monks and clerics who could read Latin had access to Plato's story of Atlantis. It was not widely discussed or elaborated during this period. The intellectual priorities of early medieval Christianity were very different from the philosophical speculation of the ancient world. But it was not lost. The fuller inheritance of Plato, including the Critias, with its detailed account of Atlantean civilization, was preserved in the Islamic world. When the centers of ancient learning fell to barbarian invasions or were disrupted by the collapse of Roman administration, the great libraries and scholarly traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean were largely taken up by Islamic scholars. Arabic translations of Greek philosophical works were made beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, during the Great Translation movement centered in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate. Plato's dialogues were translated and commented on by major thinkers including Al-Farabi and others. Islamic geographical thought in the medieval period was rich and sophisticated, and it included genuine speculation about the Atlantic Ocean. Arab geographers called the Atlantic the Sea of Darkness, Bahr al-Zulumat, a name that captures both its vastness and the fear it inspired. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which the Arabs called the Pillars of Hercules or the Columns of Tariq, after the Islamic general Tariq ibn Ziyad, who crossed through them, the ocean was largely unknown and therefore available for imagination. The great Arab polymath al-Idrisi, working in the 12th century under the patronage of King Roger II of Sicily, produced one of the most sophisticated geographical works of the medieval period. He describes islands in the Atlantic, some of them real, like the Canary Islands and possibly the Azores, and includes accounts of Atlantic voyages by Moroccan navigators who ventured westward and found only open ocean. The Atlantic was becoming mapped in rough outlines, but still harbored plenty of mystery. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the Atlantis story was not entirely dormant. Medieval writers were familiar with the concept of lands swallowed by the sea, and they had their own traditions of drowned countries. In Wales, there was the tradition of Contra Gwaelod, the Lowland Hundred, a kingdom beneath the waters of Cardigan Bay, supposedly drowned due to the negligence of a drunken sluicekeeper. In Brittany, there was Sais, a beautiful city swallowed by the sea when its wicked princess opened the sea gates. In Cornwall, there was Lyonesse, the legendary drowned land connecting Cornwall to the Isles of Scilly, said to be the homeland of the Arthurian knight Tristan. These drowned land traditions are pan-European and ancient. Some of them may reflect genuine folk memories of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 7,000 years before the Common Era, when global sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted and genuine coastal lands were flooded. The Celtic peoples of Western Europe had lived on coastlines for thousands of years, and the memory of land that had once been above water and was now beneath the sea could well have persisted in their oral traditions. Whether any of these drowned land traditions were influenced by Plato's Atlantis story, or whether they all independently reflect genuine memory of post-glacial flooding, is an open question. What seems clear is that the idea of a great civilization swallowed by the sea resonated across cultures and traditions in ways that suggest it touches something deep and genuine in the human experience of living on a world where the land and sea are always, slowly, renegotiating their boundaries. The figure of the drowned city, beautiful, lost, mourned, appears again and again in world mythological traditions. The Vedic texts of ancient India speak of the city of Dwarka, home of Krishna, being swallowed by the sea. Japanese legend speaks of the Mu Islands, submerged in the Pacific. Polynesian traditions speak of drowned lands across the vast ocean. None of these are necessarily connected to Plato's Atlantis, but they all point toward the same universal human archetype, the paradise that was, the golden age that could not last, the beautiful thing that the water took. Everything changed in the 15th century. The Renaissance, the great flowering of European learning, art, and humanism that began in Italy and spread outward, brought with it a renewed passion for the texts of the ancient Greek world. And one of the most significant events of the early Renaissance, from an intellectual standpoint, was the return of Plato's complete works to Western Europe. When Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which had continued for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West, began to crumble under Ottoman pressure in the early 15th century, Greek scholars fled westward, bringing with them manuscripts of ancient texts that had been lost in Western Europe for centuries. The Critias, the dialogue with the full account of Atlantean civilization, returned to Western European intellectual life in this period. Italian scholars received it with rapture. The great Florentine philosopher and translator Marsilio Ficino, working under the patronage of the Medici family in the second half of the 15th century, translated all of Plato's works into Latin for the first time. His translation of the Timaeus and Critias, completed around 1484, made the full Atlantis account available to every educated European who could read Latin. And in Renaissance Europe, that was a very large number of people. The timing was extraordinarily significant. Ficino's translation appeared just 8 years before Christopher Columbus sailed west from the Canary Islands in 1492 and reached the Caribbean. The age of Atlantic exploration, which would transform European understanding of the world more radically than any event since the invention of writing, was just beginning, and Europeans reading Plato's account of a great civilization in the Atlantic were reading it in a context where the Atlantic was suddenly, electrifyingly relevant. Columbus himself was deeply read in geographical speculation. He knew the Greek and Latin geographical texts. He was aware of the concept of Atlantis. Whether the Atlantis story directly influenced his thinking about what might lie to the west is debated. He was primarily motivated by the desire to find a western route to Asia, but the cultural environment in which he operated was saturated with speculation about the Atlantic and what it might contain. The discovery of the Americas, of two entire continents whose existence had been entirely unknown to Europeans, full of advanced civilizations, cities, temples, gold, had an explosive effect on the Atlantis tradition. Almost immediately, thinkers began to ask, could this be Atlantis? Could the Americas be what Plato was describing? The great Franciscan friar Francisco López de Gómara, writing in the mid-16th century, was among the first to explicitly make this connection. He suggested that the Americas were the continent Plato had described as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Others followed, the idea that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were descendants of the Atlanteans, or that their civilizations were remnants of Atlantean culture, became a persistent thread in European thinking about the New World. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman, took this idea and ran with it in one of the most influential books of the early 17th century. In 1627, the year after his death, his unfinished utopian novel, New Atlantis, was published. In it, a European ship discovers an island in the Pacific called Bensalem, whose people turn out to be the descendants of Atlantis. But Bacon's Atlantis is not the same as Plato's. In Bacon's version, Atlantis was not in the Atlantic Ocean, but in America, and it was a great empire that was destroyed not by divine punishment, but by a natural catastrophe, the memory of which the surviving peoples carried down through the generations. Bacon's New Atlantis was less interested in the historical question of whether Atlantis was real than in using the Atlantean framework to describe an ideal scientific society, a kingdom ruled by rational inquiry, where a great institution called Solomon's House, clearly modeled on what we might now call a research university, drove human progress through observation and experiment. Bacon was writing at the dawn of what would become the scientific revolution, and his Atlantis is a vision of what he hoped the future might bring. This is a significant moment in the history of the Atlantis tradition. With Bacon, the story stops being purely about the past and becomes, for the first time, a vision of the future. Atlantis becomes not just a lost civilization, but a template for the civilization that should be built. This forward-looking use of the Atlantis myth would have enormous consequences in the centuries to come. The modern obsession with Atlantis, the elaborate pseudo-scientific theories, the treasure hunters, the channeled messages from Atlantean high priests, the cottage industry of books and documentaries and websites, all of it traces back, more or less directly, to one man. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and in 1882 he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, that changed everything. Donnelly was in many ways a remarkable man. He was born in Philadelphia in 1831, trained as a lawyer, and eventually moved to Minnesota, where he served as lieutenant governor of the state, and then as a United States congressman. He was a populist politician of genuine conviction, a prolific writer, and a man of almost irrepressible intellectual energy and confidence. He was also, by the standards of modern scholarship, magnificently wrong about a great many things. But he was wrong in such a detailed, passionate, and creative way that his wrongness has proven extraordinarily influential. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, set out to prove that Plato's account was genuine history, that Atlantis had actually existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that its destruction had been the defining catastrophic event in human prehistory. Donnelly's argument was sweeping and audacious. He assembled parallels between the mythologies, languages, agricultural plants, and cultural practices of civilizations on both sides of the Atlantic, from ancient Egypt and the civilizations of Mesoamerica to the Bronze Age cultures of Europe and the indigenous peoples of North and South America, and argued that all of them were descended from a common Atlantean ancestor. The flood myths, he argued, that appear in virtually every culture around the world, the biblical Noah, the Sumerian Utnapishtim, the Hindu Manu, the Aztec Coxcox, were all memories of the same event, the sinking of Atlantis. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of the Aztecs were evidence of a shared Atlantean architectural tradition passed down to both sides. The similarities between Old World and New World agricultural plants were evidence of a common origin. The similarities between the Basque language of northern Spain and the languages of certain indigenous American peoples were evidence of a shared Atlantean tongue. None of these arguments hold up to modern scientific scrutiny. The flood myths of different cultures are not identical, and most scholars now attribute their similarities to the universal human experience of floods, rather than to a single historical catastrophe. The Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids are structurally very different and arose independently. The agricultural parallels Donnelly cited were largely based on misconceptions about which plants were native to which continents. The Basque American language connections he proposed have been thoroughly investigated and rejected by linguists. But in 1882, before modern genetics, before radiocarbon dating, before modern plate tectonics, before the full development of comparative linguistics, Donnelly's argument seemed, to many readers, like genuine scholarship. The book was a bestseller. It went through 50 printings in its first year. It was translated into multiple languages. It was read by prime ministers and presidents, by scientists and artists, and ordinary curious people. In his book, Donnelly laid out 13 propositions, which he stated at the outset he intended to prove. Among them, that Atlantis was a real geographic place that existed where Plato said it existed, in the Atlantic Ocean, that it was the original homeland of all the Aryan and Semitic races, that it was the location of the Garden of Eden, the Elysian Fields, the gardens of the Hesperides, Asgard, and all the other paradise traditions of the ancient world, that its destruction by a sudden catastrophe was the origin of all the flood myths in the world, that the races of Europe and the Americas are the surviving descendants of Atlantean peoples, and that the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece, Phoenicia, India, and the Americas were the deified kings and queens of Atlantis. The scale of this ambition is breathtaking. Donnelly was not just claiming that Atlantis existed. He was claiming that Atlantis was the single origin point for virtually all of human civilization, Every religion, every myth, every technological achievement, every cultural practice that multiple ancient civilizations shared, all of it came from Atlantis. Donnelly was turning the story of human cultural development inside out. Instead of humans independently developing similar ideas and institutions in different places because of similar human needs and similar human minds, he was proposing that it all came from one place, one time, one catastrophe. This is a model of historical thought that scholars call diffusionism, the idea that cultural similarities between distant peoples are always evidence of contact and shared origin rather than independent parallel development. It was a popular idea in the late 19th century when the full diversity of human cultural development was still poorly understood. It has since been largely discredited in its extreme forms, but it retains a powerful hold on the popular imagination. Donnelly's book did not just influence believers. It became the foundation on which nearly all subsequent Atlantis theories were built. Every writer who came after him, whether they agreed with him or disagreed, whether they placed Atlantis in the Bahamas or Antarctica or Bolivia, was responding directly or indirectly to the world Donnelly had created. He is, in that sense, the founding father of Atlantology. The year 1882 is also significant for another reason. It was the same year that the first transatlantic telegraph cable had been in operation for 15 years, and the broader cultural moment was one of rapid technological change and confident scientific exploration. Donnelly's book arrived at exactly the moment when large numbers of educated people were ready to believe that ancient history held secrets that modern science could unlock, a belief that has never entirely gone away. If Donnelly gave the modern Atlantis tradition its pseudo-scientific framework, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky gave it its spiritual soul. Blavatsky was a Russian aristocrat, adventurer, and occultist who co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875, just 7 years before Donnelly's book appeared. And her influence on the mystical, spiritual, and New Age dimensions of the Atlantis tradition is impossible to overstate. Blavatsky claimed extraordinary powers and experiences. She said she had traveled extensively through Asia and Tibet, studying with hidden masters, the Mahatmas, who possessed ancient wisdom passed down from the dawn of civilization. Her major works, Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine in 1888, claimed to reveal this hidden wisdom to the Western world. And in The Secret Doctrine, Atlantis plays a central role. According to Blavatsky's account, which she presented not as speculation, but as direct revelation from her Mahatma teachers, and from ancient sacred texts she called the stanzas of Dizyan, human history consisted of a sequence of great root races, each of which had flourished, degenerated, and been destroyed. The current human race was the 5th root race. Before us came the 4th root race, which Blavatsky called the Atlantean race. Before them came the 3rd root race, which she called the Lemurian race. The Atlanteans, in Blavatsky's account, were a civilization of enormous spiritual and technological power. They were taller than modern humans, with a different arrangement of psychic faculties. They possessed psychic abilities, telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, that modern humans have mostly lost. Their civilization lasted for millions of years, and at its height it was of extraordinary magnificence. But the Atlanteans, like Plato's Atlanteans, became corrupted. They used their powers for evil purposes. Black magic, in Blavatsky's terminology, and so they were destroyed, gradually, over millions of years, in a series of catastrophes, the last of which sank the final remnant of their continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 11,000 years ago. Blavatsky's Atlantis was larger than Plato's. She placed it in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly where Donnelly had placed it, but made it a continent-spanning civilization of inconceivable antiquity rather than a mere island empire of 9,000 years before Solon. She also added the concept of Lemuria, a third, even earlier supercontinent covering the Indian Ocean and Pacific, home of the third root race, who were, in her account, not fully human, but a sort of proto-human with very different physical and psychic characteristics. Blavatsky's ideas were wildly speculative, rooted in a curious mixture of genuine Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, Western occultism, and her own apparently unlimited inventive capacity. Modern scholars of Theosophy have not been able to identify the stanzas of Dzyan in any real ancient text, but her influence was enormous and lasting. The Theosophical Society spread across the world, and the ideas she propagated, Atlantis, Lemuria, the root races, the hidden masters, became part of the foundational vocabulary of the New Age spiritual movements that would flourish in the 20th century. Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher who began as a theosophist and later founded his own system called anthroposophy, elaborated on Blavatsky's Atlantis at great length. He devoted entire lecture series to Atlantean and Lemurian history, describing in meticulous detail the spiritual development of the Atlantean people, their relationship to the elemental forces of nature, and the nature of their eventual downfall. Edgar Cayce, the American sleeping prophet of the early 20th century, who gave thousands of trance readings on a wide range of subjects, added another layer to the mystical Atlantis tradition. Cayce claimed, during his trance states, to access the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic library of all human experience, and he described Atlantis in considerable detail. He said it had existed in the Atlantic Ocean between the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean. He said the Atlanteans had developed a form of crystal energy technology that powered their civilization, and that when these crystals were misused, they triggered the catastrophe that destroyed the island. He predicted that remnants of Atlantean civilization would be discovered near the Bahamas around 1968 or 1969. In 1968, a curious formation of large, flat, geometrically arranged stones was discovered near the island of North Bimini in the Bahamas, a formation that became known as the Bimini Road. Cayce's followers saw this as confirmation of his prophecy. Geologists have since studied the Bimini Road extensively and concluded that it is almost certainly a natural formation, what geologists call beach rock, limestone that forms naturally in regular, roughly geometric patterns as it hardens on the seafloor. But the discovery had a galvanizing effect on popular Atlantis belief. The mystical tradition of Atlantis channeled messages from Atlantean high priests, claims of past life memories from Atlantean incarnations, theories of Atlantean crystal technology, proposals that the Sphinx and the pyramids were built by Atlantean refugees, forms a vast and intricate sub-tradition that is entirely separate from either serious archaeological scholarship or even the pseudo-scientific tradition of Donnelly. It is essentially a new mythology, built on the skeleton of Plato's story, but transformed into something he would probably find very hard to recognize. Now let us move from the realm of mysticism and pseudo-history back to the domain of actual archaeology and historical scholarship, because there is a genuine, serious, and fascinating case to be made for a real historical event that might in some form underlie the Atlantis story, even if the details of Plato's account are heavily mythologized. That case centers on the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, and the Minoan civilization that flourished in the Bronze Age Aegean. The Minoans are one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. They arose on the island of Crete around 3000 before the Common Era, and for roughly 1500 years they dominated the Aegean Sea. Their civilization, named by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated the Great Palace of Knossos on Crete beginning in 1900, was extraordinarily sophisticated. They were skilled navigators and traders, with commercial networks extending across the entire eastern Mediterranean. They built multi-story palace complexes at Knossos, at Phaistos, at Malea and Zakros, decorated with breathtaking frescoes of dolphins and athletes and sacred ceremonies. They had a writing system, actually two writing systems, known as Linear A and Hieroglyphic Minoan, neither of which has been deciphered. They had sophisticated plumbing, hot and cold running water in their palaces, and evidence of an urban planning sensibility that was not matched in most of Europe for another 2000 years. The Minoans were also a maritime empire. They established colonies and trading posts throughout the Aegean, and their cultural influence extended to mainland Greece, to Egypt, to Anatolia. Homer, writing centuries later, would call the Minoans of Crete the most powerful naval force in the ancient world. The Greeks had a mythology about Crete and its king Minos, the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth of Theseus and Ariadne, that preserves in mythological form some memory of the power and strangeness of the Minoan world. Now, on the island of Thera, which lies roughly 120 kilometers north of Crete, in the heart of the Aegean, there was a large Minoan settlement. The site is now called Akrotiri, named after the modern village nearby, and it is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. Beginning in the 1960s and continuing for decades, Greek archaeologists have excavated a Bronze Age city at Akrotiri that was preserved almost perfectly by the volcanic eruption that destroyed it, in a manner very similar to how Pompeii was preserved by Mount Vesuvius. Akrotiri was a prosperous, sophisticated city. Its buildings were multi-story. Its walls were decorated with stunning frescoes of spring flowers, of swallows, of children boxing, of fishermen, of a flotilla of ships sailing between two cities. The buildings had built-in furniture of stone, sophisticated pottery of exquisite quality, and evidence of the kind of comfortable, aesthetically refined urban life that we associate with advanced civilization. The people of Akrotiri were clearly cosmopolitan and wealthy. And then, at some point in the 17th century before the Common Era, the precise date is still debated, with estimates ranging from around 1650 to around 1500 before the Common Era, the volcano beneath Thera erupted with catastrophic force. The Theran eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Volcanologists have estimated its magnitude as roughly 4 to 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, comparable to the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, or even larger. The eruption produced an enormous column of ash that spread across the eastern Mediterranean, deposited in detectable layers as far away as Greenland and Egypt. It generated tsunamis. Some estimates suggest waves as high as 30 meters that crashed across across the coasts of the Aegean, including northern Crete. It created a massive caldera collapse in which the central portion of the Theran island sank into the sea, leaving behind the distinctive crescent shape that today makes Santorini one of the most photographed places in the world. The eruption's effects on the Minoan civilization are debated but clearly significant. The ashfall alone would have disrupted agriculture across a wide area for years. The tsunamis would have devastated coastal settlements. The Minoan palaces on Crete show destruction layers dating to roughly the right period, though whether these are from the eruption itself or from subsequent earthquakes or from Mycenaean invasion is still argued. What is not debated is that the Minoan civilization as a distinctive cultural force did not survive the Middle Bronze Age. By roughly 1450 to 1400 before the Common Era, the Minoan palaces on Crete had been taken over by the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The linear A script of the Minoans was replaced by the linear B script of the Mycenaeans. The distinctive Minoan artistic style gave way to the more martial, less naturalistic Mycenaean style. The great Minoan maritime empire faded from history, and several hundred years later, the Mycenaean civilization itself collapsed. Part of the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before the Common Era, a catastrophic disruption that ended most of the advanced civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, plunging Greece into what historians call the Dark Ages. It was not until roughly 800 before the Common Era that Greek civilization began to recover and flourish again. By the time of Plato, all of this was ancient history, so ancient that it had passed entirely from historical record and survived only in fragmentary mythology. The Minoans themselves were forgotten. Their name was not known. Their writing could not be read. The memory of their civilization was preserved only in myths like the Theseus story, myths that had been transmitted orally for 800 years before anyone wrote them down. Is it possible that a memory of the Theran eruption and the Minoan collapse was preserved in Egyptian records, and that this memory was the kernel of the story Solon brought back from Sais? It is not impossible. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They had diplomatic and commercial relations with the Minoan world. Minoan-style frescoes have been found at an Egyptian site, and Egyptian goods appear in Minoan contexts. The disruption caused by the Theran eruption and its aftermath would have been noticed in Egypt. Some Egyptologists have proposed that the plagues of Egypt, described in the biblical Exodus narrative, may reflect the climatic disruptions caused by the Theran eruption, though this is speculative. But the chronological problem remains severe. Plato says, 9,000 years before Solon. Solon lived around 600 before the Common Era. So Plato's date for Atlantis is approximately 9600 before the Common Era. The Theran eruption was around 1600 before the Common Era. The discrepancy is roughly 8,000 years. The hypothesis that the original number was 900, meaning 900 years before Solon, which would place the events around 1500 before the Common Era, and that it was mistakenly multiplied by 10 somewhere in the transmission, requires a significant and unsupported assumption. A more cautious conclusion might be this: the Theran eruption and the Minoan collapse represent a real catastrophe that matches the broad outlines of the Atlantis story, a great maritime civilization in the Aegean destroyed by volcanic and geological catastrophe. Whether this connection is causal, whether Plato was working, however indirectly, with a real memory of these events, remains genuinely uncertain. But it is the most scientifically respectable proposal for a real-world basis for the Atlantis story, and it has been taken seriously by a significant number of legitimate archaeologists and historians. In recent years, particularly on social media and in a wave of popular YouTube documentaries, a new location theory for Atlantis has attracted enormous attention. It centers on a geological formation in the Sahara Desert of Mauritania called the Richat structure, also known, because of its striking appearance from orbit, as the Eye of the Sahara. The Richat structure is genuinely remarkable looking. Viewed from space, it appears as a series of concentric rings, circular ridges of rock that alternate with lower-lying areas, giving it an uncanny resemblance to the description in the Critias of the concentric rings of water and land surrounding the capital city of Atlantis. The outer diameter of the Richat structure is approximately 50 kilometers, large enough to contain the kind of civilization Plato described. Proponents of the theory point to several apparent parallels. The concentric ring structure, the location near what was once a coastal area before the Sahara dried up, the presence of ancient river systems in the region, and measurements of the rings that some enthusiasts claim match the dimensions given in the Critias. The theory gained massive popular traction beginning around 2018 and 2019, when several YouTube channels and online researchers pushed it into the cultural mainstream. The argument in its most elaborated form goes something like this. The Sahara was not always a desert. During a climatic period known as the African Humid Period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, which lasted roughly from 11,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era, much of what is now desert was savanna, with lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. During this period, the region around the Richat structure would have been far more habitable. The ancient Draw River system ran nearby. The Atlantic coast of West Africa was not far, and the Richat structure itself, sitting in what would then have been a fertile, well-watered landscape, might have been visible to ancient maritime peoples sailing along the African coast. Proponents argue that when Plato said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, this description is consistent with the coast of West Africa, south of the Strait of Gibraltar, in the open Atlantic or along its margins. They argue that the gradual drying of the Sahara, combined with rising sea levels after the last ice age, could have made the region increasingly uninhabitable, and that the final drying, or a major flooding event, could be the sinking that Plato describes. It is an imaginative and visually compelling theory, and the Richat structure really is striking. But it has serious problems that have led essentially every geologist and archaeologist who has examined it to reject the Atlantis identification. First, the Richat structure is not in fact a series of concentric rings of land and water. It is a geological formation, specifically a deeply eroded dome of rock called a pericline or a structural dome, formed over hundreds of millions of years by the upwelling and subsequent erosion of ancient rock layers. The different colored rings visible from space are different rock strata exposed by erosion. They are not, and never were, rings of water. There is no geological evidence that the structure was ever surrounded by alternating rings of sea and land in the way Plato describes. Second, the Richat structure is located entirely inland, several hundred kilometers from the Atlantic coast. For it to have been Atlantis, the level of the Atlantic Ocean would need to have been dramatically higher than it is today, high enough to flood the entire northwestern corner of Africa to a depth that would place the ocean at the doorstep of the structure. While sea levels have changed since the last ice age, the scale of change required for this theory is far beyond what the geological evidence supports. Third, there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever of a Bronze Age or earlier advanced civilization at or near the Richat structure. The theory predicts that if this were the site of Atlantis, there should be some traces, foundations, artifacts, metallurgical evidence, any sign of a highly organized society of the kind Plato describes. Surveys of the region have found Neolithic and later Berber habitation sites, but nothing remotely matching the scale or complexity of Plato's account. Fourth, the dimensional matches that proponents claim between the Richat structure and Plato's description are, on careful examination, either approximate to the point of meaninglessness or achieved by selectively using different unit conversions for different measurements. The structure has been made to fit Plato's numbers rather than the numbers being independently derived and then found to match. The Richat structure theory is a good example of a broader phenomenon in Atlantis research: the human tendency to find patterns, to see what we want to see, and to construct elaborate explanatory frameworks around genuine but ultimately non-diagnostic similarities. The eye shape of the Richat structure is compelling. The concentric rings are visually evocative of Plato's description, but visual resemblance is not evidence, and the geological, geographical, and archaeological evidence does not support the identification. That said, the theory's popularity is itself interesting and worth noting. It spread with remarkable speed through social media and video platforms precisely because it is visually arresting. The satellite images of the Richat structure are genuinely stunning, and because it offers what feels like a concrete, locatable answer to a question that has frustrated people for centuries. The hunger for that answer, the desire to find Atlantis, to pin it down and say there it is, that hunger is itself part of the story of Atlantis, and we will return to it. The most traditional placement for Atlantis, the one that matches Plato's text most literally, is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This was Donnelly's placement, and it remains the one that most people picture when they imagine Atlantis, a vast island civilization somewhere in the deep Atlantic, now lying miles beneath the surface. The geological basis for this theory was, in Donnelly's time, the discovery of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range running roughly north to south through the center of the Atlantic Ocean, from Iceland in the north to near Antarctica in the south. Donnelly seized on this discovery with excitement. Here, he argued, was the geological remnant of the Atlantean landmass, the backbone of the drowned continent, poking up from the ocean floor in a long chain that proved something large had once stood above the waves. Some of the islands that do exist in the Atlantic, the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands, Madeira, sit on or near the Mid-Atlantic Ridge or the continental shelves of Africa and Europe. Donnelly proposed that these islands were the mountaintops of the sunken Atlantean continent, the peaks of a drowned landscape. This theory was definitively overturned by the development of plate tectonics in the mid-20th century. We now know with confidence what the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is. It is a divergent plate boundary where two tectonic plates, the North American plate and the Eurasian plate in the north, the South American plate and the African plate in the south, are slowly moving apart. New oceanic crust is being created at the ridge as magma wells up from below. The ridge has never been above the ocean surface, except at Iceland, where a volcanic hotspot adds to the ridge and pushes it above sea level. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic. The ocean floor of the deep Atlantic is oceanic crust, not continental crust, and it has been beneath the ocean for tens of millions of years. This geological reality does not stop some enthusiasts from proposing that a continent-sized landmass could have sunk beneath the Atlantic through some other mechanism. But plate tectonics is one of the most thoroughly tested and confirmed
confirmed theories in all of Earth science.
The idea that a continent-sized landmass could sink several miles beneath the ocean's surface in a single day and a single night, as Plato describes, is not just geologically impossible under normal conditions. It is impossible under any conditions that could have existed during human prehistory. Continents do not sink, they float on the denser mantle rock beneath them, like rafts of lighter material on a denser fluid. Even when tectonic forces pull oceanic crust down into the mantle, a process called subduction, continental crust is too buoyant to follow. This is why the continents have been above water for billions of years, while oceanic crust is recycled every few 100 million years. The deep ocean floor of the Atlantic has been thoroughly surveyed and mapped. There is no evidence of sunken architecture, no evidence of a landmass large enough to support a great civilization, no anomaly that cannot be explained by ordinary geological processes. Atlantis is not in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Over the centuries, researchers, enthusiasts, and genuine scholars have proposed locations for Atlantis on literally every continent and in many different seas. The number and variety of proposed locations is itself a kind of testament to the story's power. It is capable of being mapped onto almost any geography because its details are both specific enough to seem locatable and vague enough to resist definitive placement. The Iberian Peninsula and the adjacent continental shelf have attracted considerable attention. The area around the Gulf of Cadiz, near the modern city of Cadiz in southwestern Spain, which the ancient world knew as Gadir, has been proposed by several researchers as the location of the Atlantean capital, with the suggestion that the city lies buried under the sediments of the estuary of the Guadalquivir River or beneath the shallow waters off the coast. The area has been surveyed using satellite imagery, aerial photography, and ground-penetrating radar, and while some researchers have claimed to detect anomalous geometric structures beneath the surface, no confirmed archaeological remains of a large civilization have been found. Marc-André Gutcher, a French geologist, proposed in 2001 that Atlantis might be associated with the Spartel Island, a small submerged bank in the Strait of Gibraltar that was above sea level during the last ice age and would have sunk as sea levels rose at the end of the glaciation. The island is real. It genuinely was above water and genuinely did sink, but it is small, only about 14 kilometers by 27 kilometers, and far too modest to match Plato's description of an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. The Black Sea has been proposed as a location for Atlantis by some researchers, drawing on the genuinely dramatic history of that sea. The Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, cut off from the Mediterranean. Around 7600 before the Common Era, according to a theory proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, the rising Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural barrier at the Bosphorus, catastrophically flooding the Black Sea basin and raising its surface by many meters. This was a real and dramatic geological event, and it may indeed have displaced human populations living around the former lake's shores. Whether this event is related to ancient flood myths is debated, but it is at least a real catastrophe of the right general type. Antarctica has been proposed as the location of Atlantis by several writers, based primarily on the hypothesis associated with Charles Hapgood's theory of Earth crust displacement. that the entire outer crust of the Earth can periodically shift, potentially moving Antarctica from a more temperate location to its current polar position within a geologically short time. Hapgood's theory has no support in mainstream geology and is incompatible with plate tectonics, but it attracted the endorsement of Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to Hapgood's 1958 book, a fact that Hapgood's proponents cite to this day. Einstein's foreword was polite and curious, but does not actually endorse the theory, and Hapgood's specific claims have been examined and found to lack geological support. The Canary Islands and the Azores have each been proposed as remnants of Atlantis. The Canaries in particular have attracted attention because they are located in the Atlantic, west of the African coast, and because one of them, Lanzarote, has a genuinely dramatic volcanic landscape that some find evocative of Plato's descriptions. The indigenous Guanche people of the Canary Islands, who were encountered by European explorers in the 14th and 15th centuries and are now extinct as a distinct culture, were sometimes romanticized by early modern writers as potential descendants of Atlanteans. The Caribbean has been a persistent location for Atlantis theories, partly because of Edgar Case's prophecy and the Bimini Road discovery, and partly because the Caribbean is a geologically active region. There are genuine submerged landmasses that were above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The Bahama Banks in particular were largely dry land during the last glacial maximum and would have been flooded as the glaciers melted. But there is no archaeological evidence of an advanced Bronze Age civilization there. Mesoamerica itself has been proposed in various forms as the location of Atlantis, the argument being that Plato's account is a distorted description of one of the great civilizations of the Americas, perhaps the Olmec or the Maya. The Olmec civilization of southern Mexico, which flourished roughly from 1500 to 400 before the Common Era, was indeed a sophisticated and in many ways mysterious civilization, the progenitor of many later Mesoamerican cultural developments. But the Olmec were not destroyed in a single day by earthquake and flood, and there is no basis for identifying them with Plato's Atlanteans beyond a general impressiveness. The island of Sardinia in the western Mediterranean was proposed as the location of Atlantis by Italian journalist and author Sergio Frau in a 2002 book that attracted considerable media attention. Frau argued that the ancient pillars of Hercules were not at Gibraltar, but at the narrow strait between Sicily and Tunisia, the Sicilian Channel, and that Atlantis was therefore in the western Mediterranean rather than the Atlantic. Sardinia has a remarkable Bronze Age civilization called the Nuragic culture, whose stone towers, Nuraga, dot the island's landscape in their hundreds. The Nuragic civilization was indeed disrupted and eventually declined around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. Frau's thesis has been treated with interest by some scholars and skepticism by others. The list goes on. Malta, with its extraordinary megalithic temples among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world. The Sundaland theory, which proposes that Atlantis was a large landmass in Southeast Asia that was flooded when post-glacial sea levels rose. Ireland, proposed by various Celtic enthusiasts. The island of Crete itself, proposed by Spyridon Maronatus and others who see the Minoan connection as direct rather than indirect. Bolivia and the High Andes Plateau, proposed by researcher Jim Allen, who found the geographical descriptions of the Great Plain and the surrounding mountains a better match for the Altiplano than for any Atlantic location. The multiplicity of proposed locations is, in its own way, decisive evidence that the story cannot be definitively placed. If Atlantis were a real place with a real geological record, the evidence would eventually narrow the candidates to one. The continued proliferation of locations, each with its own enthusiasts, its own selective reading of Plato, its own compelling visual parallels, suggests instead that Atlantis is functioning as a mirror, reflecting back to each seeker the civilization they most want to find. Let us be clear and direct about the current state of mainstream scholarly and scientific opinion on Atlantis, because it is sometimes obscured by the enormous popular attention the topic receives. The overwhelming consensus among archaeologists, classicists, historians of ancient Greece, geologists, and oceanographers is that Atlantis, as described by Plato, did not exist as a historical reality. This consensus is not based on dogma or closed-mindedness. It is based on a thorough examination of the evidence and the absence of evidence. There is no ancient text other than Plato's that mentions Atlantis. This is remarkable, given how widely read Plato was in the ancient world, and how significant a civilization Atlantis was supposed to have been. If Atlantis had actually controlled large parts of Europe and Africa, had fielded armies of hundreds of thousands, had maintained a trading network that touched every corner of the ancient world, we would expect some trace of it in other ancient records. Egyptian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Hittite. We have no such trace. The geological record of the Atlantic Ocean is thoroughly incompatible with a large landmass having sunk beneath it in the last 12,000 years. Oceanic sediment cores, seafloor mapping, and the well-understood behavior of tectonic plates all rule out the kind of sudden catastrophic sinking Plato describes. The archaeological record of the Mediterranean and Atlantic world in the relevant period, roughly 10,000 to 9,000 before the Common Era, shows human populations at a hunter-gatherer or early agricultural stage of development, the kind of urban civilization Plato describes with metalworking, monumental architecture, organized navies, standing armies, a literate administrative class, does not appear anywhere in the archaeological record until thousands of years later. The framing of the Atlantis account in the Timaeus and Critias is consistent with a literary invention. Plato uses similar framing devices, including chains of transmission through multiple narrators, for other stories he clearly invented. The moral and philosophical purposes the story serves are clear and self-contained within the dialogues. Plato had everything he needed to invent the story without any external source. None of this means the Atlantis story is uninteresting or unimportant. A story can be fictional and still be one of the most culturally significant stories ever told. The Iliad is probably not a historically accurate account of a 10-year siege of Troy, but it is one of the greatest works of literature in the Western tradition. The story of Eden is not a geological description of a real garden, but it has shaped human thought about innocence, corruption, and loss for millennia. Atlantis belongs in this category, a story so resonant, so perfectly constructed, so aligned with deep human anxieties and longings that its truth is of a different order than historical truth. The question, was Atlantis real, is in many ways the wrong question. The better question is, what does the story of Atlantis reveal about us? And that question has extraordinarily rich answers. Why has the story of Atlantis captivated human imagination for over 2,000 years? Why does it still produce new books, new documentaries, new theories, new searches, new dreams? What is it about this particular story, a philosopher's tale of a sunken island that has proven so inexhaustibly magnetic. Part of the answer lies in the structure of the story itself. The Atlantis story contains several of the most powerful narrative elements that human psychology responds to most deeply. There is the Golden Age. Nearly every culture in human history has a tradition of a better time in the past. An Eden, an age of heroes, a time before the fall. The Atlantis story taps into this universal archetype with particular vividness. Plato's Atlanteans, in their early days, were not just wealthy and powerful. They were genuinely good. They had something we have lost. The story gives this universal sense of loss a specific, historical, almost geographical form. There is the catastrophe, the sudden, total, irrevocable destruction of Atlantis in a single day and a single night is one of the most dramatic narrative moments in ancient literature. It satisfies something in the human imagination, the fantasy of a reckoning, of a moment when the scales are balanced, when pride meets its punishment. It also taps into something very real, the human experience of sudden loss, of things that were there and then were not, of the way catastrophe can erase everything without warning. There is the hidden knowledge, the idea that somewhere beneath the ocean there is a buried library of human achievement, a civilization that knew things we have forgotten, that possessed technologies or wisdoms or powers that we have lost. This idea is almost irresistibly compelling to a certain kind of mind. It implies that the present is not the pinnacle of human development, that we are not at the top of a long climb, but somewhere in the middle of a much longer story, and that the treasures of the past might be recoverable if only we know where to look. There is the warning. The fall of Atlantis is a cautionary tale of the most direct kind. Here was a civilization that had everything: abundance, power, beauty, sophistication, and it threw it away through greed and hubris. This is not just Plato's moral lesson. It is a story that every generation has been able to apply to its own moment, its own society, its own anxieties about where things are heading. In the 19th century, it spoke to fears about industrial capitalism. In the early 20th century, it spoke to fears about the destructive power of modern warfare. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it speaks to fears about environmental destruction, about the possibility that our own civilization might be heading toward a catastrophic reckoning. And there is the mystery. No definitive answer has ever been given, and perhaps no definitive answer can ever be given, to the question of whether Atlantis was real. This unresolvability is not a flaw, it is a feature. A mystery that can be definitively solved becomes trivia. A mystery that cannot be solved becomes mythology. Atlantis has achieved the rare and powerful status of being permanently uncertain, permanently available to imagination, permanently capable of new interpretations, permanently alive. The 20th century philosopher Ernst Cassirer, writing about the nature of myth, argued that mythology is not failed science. It is not an attempt to explain the world that hasn't yet found the right method. It is a different mode of engagement with the world altogether, one that addresses questions of meaning rather than questions of mechanism. By this understanding, the Atlantis story is not a primitive attempt to explain a geological event. It is a sophisticated engagement with questions of civilization, virtue, power, and loss that science cannot address. The philosopher Karl Popper, writing about the nature of scientific knowledge, pointed out that a theory that cannot be falsified is not scientific. The Atlantis story, as it has evolved through the centuries, has become unfalsifiable in a very particular way. Every time evidence is found against a specific proposed location, the story simply migrates to another location. The Atlantic Ocean didn't pan out? Try Santorini. Santorini doesn't fit the dates. Try the Sahara. The Sahara doesn't fit the geology. Try Antarctica. The story is always just beyond reach, always in the next unexplored place, always available for the next generation of seekers. This is not a failure of the story. It is precisely what myths do. They survive by being flexible, by accommodating new contexts, by being large enough to contain contradictions. The Atlantis story has demonstrated this capacity for survival with remarkable consistency across 23 centuries. The story of Atlantis did not just inspire pseudoscientific theories and mystical speculation. It also inspired some of the most significant literary and political works of the early modern period, works that used the Atlantis framework to imagine alternative societies and better worlds. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in 1627, has already been mentioned as a turning point in the story's cultural history, the moment when Atlantis stopped being purely a story about the past and became a vision of the future. But Bacon's work deserves more detailed attention because it is a genuinely important document in the history of ideas. Bacon was the architect of what he called the Great Instauration, a complete renewal of human knowledge based on empirical observation and systematic experiment. He believed that the learning of the ancient Greeks, whatever its philosophical merits, had not produced practical benefits for humanity. What was needed, he argued, was a new kind of knowledge, one that could be used to control and improve the natural world, to relieve human suffering, to extend human life, to feed and clothe and house people better. This was not knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge for human benefit. In New Atlantis, the island of Bensalem is governed by an institution called Solomon's House, described in loving detail as a kind of ideal research institution. It has observatories for astronomical work, laboratories for chemical and biological experiments, facilities for testing new technologies, libraries and databases of accumulated knowledge, a hierarchy of researchers with different specialized functions. Reading it today, one is struck by how much it resembles a modern university or a major corporate research and development facility. Bacon was essentially designing the institutional structure of modern science, and he was using the Atlantis framework, the ideal island civilization beyond the ordinary world, as the setting. New Atlantis was enormously influential. It is one of the inspirations for the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, which was the first major scientific society in the modern world and remains one of the most prestigious. The Fellows of the Royal Society in their early years were explicitly aware of and inspired by Bacon's vision. Atlantis, in this sense, contributed directly to the development of modern science. Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, just over a century before Bacon's work, is not about Atlantis directly, but it uses the same structural device, an island in the ocean, beyond the known world, where a better society has been achieved. More's utopia is almost certainly influenced by the Atlantis tradition, and it in turn influenced Bacon's New Atlantis. This chain of utopian imagination, from Plato's ideal island to More's island of Utopia to Bacon's island of Bensalem, forms one of the most important threads in the development of Western political thought. Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, written in 1602 while Campanella was in prison for heresy, imagines a city built on a great hill surrounded by 7 concentric walls, governed by a philosopher-priest. The concentric structure evokes Plato's Atlantis, perhaps deliberately. Campanella's city is governed by reason and by the pursuit of perfect knowledge of nature, and it is free of private property and class distinctions. It is, in essence, a communist utopia expressed in the language of Renaissance Neoplatonism with strong Atlantean echoes. James Harrington's Oceana, published in 1656, is a political treatise in the form of a utopian narrative, imagining an ideal English republic that uses the name Oceana as a transparent stand-in for England, but also evokes the broader tradition of the ideal island civilization that stretches back through Bacon and More to Plato. Harrington's work influenced the framers of the American Constitution, particularly James Madison, and through them the entire modern tradition of republican government. The influence of the Atlantis tradition on utopian thought is not accidental. Plato's original account already had utopian dimensions. The Athens that defeated Atlantis was an idealized city, a philosophical ideal given historical form, and the conceit of an island, isolated, self-contained, different from the corrupt ordinary world, is perfectly suited to utopian imagination. An island can be whatever you want it to be, precisely because its isolation removes it from the constraints of ordinary history. The discovery of the Americas transformed not just the geography of the world, but the mythology of the world. And the Atlantis story was one of the mythological frameworks most immediately and powerfully activated by the encounter with the New World. Christopher Columbus, on his first voyage in 1492, was looking for a western route to Asia. He found the Caribbean instead, and when the full scale of what had been found began to sink in, 2 entire continents, stretching from the Arctic to the Antarctic, unknown to European geographical tradition, the question of how they fit into the existing framework of history and mythology became urgent. The biblical tradition gave one answer. These were the descendants of Noah, scattered to unknown lands after the flood. The classical tradition gave another. This was Plato's Atlantis, or its remnant, or its colony. The Aztec and Inca empires, with their gold and their monuments and their sophisticated organization, seemed to some European observers to confirm the idea of an Atlantean heritage. These peoples were too advanced, too sophisticated, too culturally complex to have developed independently. They must have received their civilization from somewhere. And the most dramatic origin story available was Atlantis. This thinking was, of course, deeply wrong. The indigenous civilizations of the Americas were fully independent developments, the product of thousands of years of human ingenuity, observation, and cultural evolution, with no connection to any Old World civilization. The similarities between Mesoamerican and Old World monumental architecture, for example, are not evidence of contact.
They are evidence of the universality of human responses to certain kinds of social and religious needs. People build pyramids in different places and at different times because the pyramid shape is structurally efficient and symbolically powerful, not because they all learned it from the same source. But the Atlantis-America connection persisted in European thinking about the New World for centuries, with consequences that were sometimes merely curious and sometimes genuinely harmful. The idea that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were degraded descendants of a higher civilization, the Atlantean heritage corrupted by time and isolation, was used by some European writers to explain and justify the conquest. If these people had once been great but had fallen from their original nobility, then the Europeans were simply restoring the proper order of things.
This is one of the darker applications of the Atlantis story, a use of an ancient myth to serve a contemporary political agenda, dressing up colonialism in the language of destiny and heritage. The Spanish missionary and historian Bartolomé de las Casas, writing in the mid-16th century, was one of the most passionate defenders of the indigenous peoples of the Americas against Spanish cruelty. He did not use the Atlantis framework, but he addressed the same underlying question: what was the origin of these peoples, and what did their history mean? His answer was grounded in a Christian universalism that recognized their full humanity. He rejected the idea that they were inferior or degraded. They were simply people who had not yet received the gospel, and their conquest and enslavement were crimes, not civilizing missions. Las Casas' position was a minority view in his time, but it was the correct one, and his rejection of the degraded descendant model, whether it was framed in Atlantean or any other terms, points toward the kind of intellectual clarity that the Atlantis myth, in its less disciplined forms, sometimes obscures. The 20th century brought to the Atlantis question both the most powerful tools for investigation and the most vivid popular culture. On one hand, the development of oceanography, plate tectonics, radiocarbon dating, satellite imaging, underwater archaeology, and genetic analysis gave researchers capabilities that previous centuries could not have imagined. On the other hand, the rise of mass media, popular books, cinema, radio, and television gave the Atlantis story new vehicles for reaching ever larger audiences. The scientific investigations produced clear results, as we have already discussed. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic, no evidence of an advanced civilization in the relevant geological strata, no archaeological confirmation of the specific claims made by Donnelly or Blavatsky, but they also produced something more interesting than a simple refutation. They produced a much richer understanding of the real history of the ancient Mediterranean world, a history full of genuine catastrophes, genuine lost civilizations, and genuine mysteries. The rediscovery of the Minoan civilization by Arthur Evans at the turn of the 20th century revealed a real Bronze Age maritime empire that had been entirely forgotten. The excavation of Akrotiri on Santorini from the 1960s onward revealed a real city destroyed by a real volcanic catastrophe. The discovery and decipherment of Linear B, the Mycenaean script, by Michael Ventris in 1952 opened a window into the Bronze Age world that showed it to be far more complex, far more connected, and far more precarious than the Greeks of the classical period had imagined. The genetic revolution, the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA, has in the 21st century revealed the movements of human populations over tens of thousands of years in extraordinary detail. We can now
trace how modern Europeans are descended from a complex mixture of hunter-gatherers, early farmers who came from Anatolia, and steppe pastoralists who moved west from the Eurasian grasslands. None of this genetic evidence shows any trace of a separate Atlantean population. The genetics of human populations in the Atlantic region is fully explicable without any appeal to a lost island civilization. In popular culture, meanwhile, the 20th century produced an explosion of Atlantis imagery. H.G. Wells wrote about Atlantis.
Jules Verne included it in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, in one of the most evocative passages in that novel, when Captain Nemo takes Professor Aronnax on a moonlit underwater walk through the ruins of the drowned continent. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a novel called The Maricotte Deep, in which explorers encounter surviving descendants of the Atlanteans living in an undersea dome. The early 20th century saw Atlantis incorporated into the emerging genre of science fiction. Lost worlds beneath the sea, populated by descendants of Atlantean technology, became a stock element of pulp adventure fiction. Edgar Rice Burroughs, the creator of Tarzan, wrote his own Lost World stories with Atlantean echoes. The genre proliferated. Film found Atlantis almost immediately. Silent films of the early 20th century dramatized the sinking of the continent. Sound films of the 1930s and 1940s continued the tradition. In 1961, the American filmmaker George Pal directed Atlantis, The Lost Continent, a sword and sandal epic that portrayed the island civilization as a combination of Roman decadence and proto-fascist militarism, very much in the Cold War idiom of its time. The film is campy by modern standards but reveals how naturally the Atlantis story absorbs the anxieties of its era. The most culturally significant 20th century cinematic treatment of Atlantis is probably the 1989 animated series The Mysterious Cities of Gold, a French-Japanese co-production that wove Atlantean themes into the story of the Spanish conquest of the Americas with surprising sophistication. And in 2001, Disney produced Atlantis: The Lost Empire, a full animated feature that drew on genuine mythological and artistic sources, including the design of the Atlantean language developed by linguist Mark Okrand, who had also created the Klingon language for Star Trek, to produce a visual adventure that introduced the Atlantis story to a new generation of children. In music, from the 1960s counterculture onward, Atlantis became a touchstone for certain kinds of spiritual seeking and romantic longing. Donovan's 1968 song Atlantis, a dreamy, hypnotic evocation of the lost civilization, became one of the defining songs of the psychedelic era. Later musicians from across the spectrum referenced Atlantis as a shorthand for beauty, loss, and the longing for a better world. We have touched on this theme throughout the script, but it deserves fuller treatment because the political dimensions of the Atlantis story are among its most sophisticated and enduring features. Plato was writing in the shadow of the Peloponnesian War, Athens' catastrophic defeat by Sparta, and in the immediate aftermath of his teacher Socrates' execution. He was also writing in an era when Athens was rebuilding and reasserting itself, with some of its old imperial ambitions stirring again. He was acutely aware of the dangers of imperial overreach, of democracy corrupted by demagoguery, of a city that confused greatness with virtue. The opposition in the Atlantis story between Athens and Atlantis is not a simple opposition between good and evil. It is a moral and political analysis of two different kinds of power. Atlantis represents power without virtue. It has everything: wealth, technology, military might, a global empire, but it has lost the inner quality that made those things meaningful. Its people are, as Plato says, unable to bear the burden of their own prosperity. They mistake the glitter of gold for the good life, the expansion of empire for genuine achievement. They are, in the deepest philosophical sense, unhappy, not because they lack anything material, but because they have substituted material abundance for the genuine human fulfillment that comes only from virtue and wisdom. The ancient Athens of the story represents the opposite, virtue without the need for power. This ideal Athens is a city that fights not for dominion but for justice. It asks nothing for itself. It faces the overwhelming military machine of Atlantis alone when its allies have collapsed or surrendered, and it does so not out of pride or ambition but out of a genuine commitment to the good. It is, in Plato's moral universe, a city of philosopher kings in action, not perhaps in the literal sense of the philosopher king of the Republic, but in the deeper sense of a community that is organized around the pursuit of genuine goodness rather than apparent goodness. Plato's contemporary Athens, the Athens of his own time, fails by both these standards. It is not as virtuously simple as his ideal ancient Athens, but it is also not as powerfully imperial as Atlantis. It is something worse, a democracy that has the worst features of both types, pursuing empire abroad while being corrupted by demagoguery at home, capable of great things, but also capable of executing the wisest man in the city on a trumped-up charge. The political allegory works on several levels simultaneously. Atlantis can be read as Persia, the great empire from the east that Athens had defeated in the Persian Wars. It can be read as Sparta, the militaristic, disciplined, materially successful power that had eventually defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War. It can be read as the earlier Athenian Empire itself, the Delian League, which Athens had turned from a defensive alliance into an exploitive instrument of imperial control. And it can be read as a general type, the kind of civilization that any great power becomes when it prioritizes strength over justice. This flexibility is what gives the political allegory its enduring power. Every generation finds its own Atlantis, its own version of the powerful, corrupt civilization that serves as the dark mirror of what their own society might become. In the 19th century, Atlantis evoked fears about the corrupting influence of industrial capitalism. In the early 20th century, it evoked fears about the militarism that produced the world wars. In the Cold War era, it evoked fears about both superpowers, the nuclear-armed giants capable of destroying civilization in a single day and a single night. In the early 21st century, it evokes fears about a global civilization growing so large and so resource-dependent that it is becoming fragile in ways it does not fully understand. Plato could not have foreseen all of these applications, but he built something flexible and deep enough to accommodate them. That is what the best philosophical stories do. One of the most persistent questions in Atlantis scholarship is whether the Egyptian framing of the story has any genuine historical basis. Plato claims that Solon heard the story from Egyptian priests at the city of Sais, in the western Nile Delta. Was Solon really in Egypt? Did Sais really have records going back 9,000 years? And if Plato was inventing the story, why did he go to the trouble of inventing an Egyptian provenance for it? Solon's Egyptian visit is mentioned not just in Plato's dialogues, but in Plutarch's Life of Solon and in various other ancient sources. The general tradition that Solon traveled to Egypt during his self-imposed exile from Athens, which historically lasted about 10 years, beginning around 594 before the Common Era, is widely accepted by historians. Whether he visited Sais specifically is not confirmed by any source other than Plato, but Sais was a major city and religious center in the period, and it is not implausible. The city of Sais, known in ancient Egyptian as Zau and located in the western Nile Delta, was a city of considerable antiquity and importance. It was the cult center of the goddess Neith, a deity associated with wisdom, weaving, war, and creation, who had been worshipped in Egypt since the early dynastic period, roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era. The 26th dynasty, which ruled Egypt for much of the 6th century before the Common Era, exactly the period of Solon's travels, was based at Sais, making it the de facto capital of Egypt. The pharaohs of this dynasty were notable for their openness to Greek merchants and craftsmen, establishing a special trading city called Naucratis in the Delta specifically for Greek commerce. The priests of Sais would indeed have had access to ancient records. Egyptian temples maintained archival collections of papyri and inscribed records going back many generations. The temple libraries of major Egyptian cult centers are attested in ancient sources, and while these records certainly did not go back 9,000 years, they could plausibly have preserved records going back 2,000 or 3,000 years from Solon's time, records that would have included Egyptian contacts with and knowledge of the Aegean world during the Bronze Age. Some Egyptologists have pointed out that Egyptian texts from the Bronze Age period do record disruptions and migrations that could be relevant to the broader cultural context of the Atlantis story. The Sea Peoples inscriptions, particularly those from the reign of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, dating to around 1175 before the Common Era, describe a massive wave of peoples from the north and west who attacked Egypt and destabilized the entire eastern Mediterranean. These sea peoples have been associated with the late Bronze Age collapse, and some of them may have been refugees from or participants in the destruction of Aegean civilizations, including the Mycenaeans, and indirectly the Minoan world. The Sea Peoples inscriptions do not mention Atlantis by name, but they do describe a world in which great civilizations were collapsing, in which whole peoples were being swept away in catastrophic disruptions, in which the settled order of the Bronze Age world was dissolving. If Egyptian priests of the 6th century before the Common Era were drawing on records of this period, records that described the fall of powerful seafaring civilizations to the north and west, and if Solon was listening and recording, the result might well have been a story that, after many retellings and Plato's philosophical elaboration, emerged as the account we have. This is speculative, but it is a more nuanced and historically grounded speculation than most of what has been written about Atlantis. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Atlantis question is what it reveals about the nature of human cultural memory, about how stories survive, how they transform, and how they connect the present to a past so distant that it lies beyond the reach of ordinary historical method. Cognitive scientists and anthropologists have become increasingly interested in what they call deep history, the study of human prehistory, using tools drawn from archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and the analysis of oral traditions. One of the striking findings of this field is that oral traditions, under certain conditions, can preserve genuine information about events in the distant past, sometimes much more distant than most historians would expect. An example: Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe a time when the sea level was lower and certain coastal areas were dry land have been analyzed by geologists and found to correspond in their broad outlines to actual changes in Australian coastal geography that occurred between 7,000 and 18,000 years ago, when post-glacial sea level rise was flooding areas that had previously been dry. These traditions were transmitted orally across hundreds of generations and maintained sufficient accuracy to be geologically informative. This does not mean that all oral traditions preserve accurate historical information. Most oral traditions are heavily shaped by cultural needs, mythological frameworks, and the creative retellings of each generation. But it does mean that the possibility of oral traditions preserving genuine memories of ancient geological events, including catastrophic floods, volcanic eruptions, and the flooding of coastal lands, should not be dismissed out of hand. If the Theran eruption of roughly 1600 before the Common Era was experienced as a catastrophic disruption by Mediterranean civilizations, and given its scale, this is not in doubt, then it is at least plausible that memories of this disruption were preserved in the oral traditions of various Mediterranean peoples. And it is at least plausible that these memories, as they were transmitted across 1500 years from the eruption to Plato's time, were transformed and mythologized in ways that make them hard to recognize as a direct account of the original event. This is the most generous and scientifically interesting version of the argument for a real basis for the Atlantis story. Not that Plato was reporting accurate history, not that there really was a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, but that at the deepest level of the story, beneath the concentric rings and the orichalcum walls and the divine genealogies, there may be an echo, however distorted, of real human experiences of real catastrophes in the ancient Mediterranean world. The human desire to preserve memory, to transmit experience across generations, to insist that the past matters, this is itself one of the most ancient and defining human impulses.
The story of Atlantis, whatever its ultimate origin, is also a story about that impulse. It is a record of the fact that humans remember, that they insist on the importance of what has been lost, that they keep looking, even when what they are looking for may not exist in the form they imagine.
The 21st century has brought extraordinary new tools to the search for evidence of ancient civilizations. Satellite imaging with radar and infrared sensors can reveal buried structures invisible to the eye. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has transformed jungle archaeology by penetrating forest canopy to reveal the landscape beneath. Underwater drones and remotely operated vehicles can survey the ocean floor at depths that would have been inaccessible to previous generations. Genetic analysis can trace population movements across thousands of years. Ground-penetrating radar can show anomalies beneath surface sediments without excavation. These tools have produced genuine discoveries in the archaeology of the ancient world. LiDAR surveys in Cambodia revealed the extent of the Angkor Empire as far larger than previously known. In Honduras, LiDAR revealed a lost city of the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican world, now known as the City of the Jaguar. In Egypt, satellite imaging has identified dozens of previously unknown archaeological sites beneath the desert sands. None of these tools have found Atlantis. This is significant. The Mediterranean and Atlantic seafloor have been extensively surveyed using modern oceanographic technology.
The continental shelves, the submerged extensions of the continents which were above water during the last ice age, have been mapped with increasing precision. The results have been scientifically fascinating. They have revealed submerged river valleys, ancient coastlines, the preserved remains of landscapes that were indeed dry land before the post-glacial sea level rise.
But they have not revealed the ruins of an advanced Bronze Age civilization. What they have revealed, however, is how genuinely dramatic the end of the last ice age was for human populations around the world. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters as the great ice sheets melted. This is not a trivial change. Vast areas of coastal land, areas that had been inhabited by human populations for thousands of years, were flooded. The Black Sea basin was dramatically expanded. The Persian Gulf was flooded from what had been a fertile river valley. The North Sea and the English Channel emerged from dry land. The Indonesian archipelago was transformed from a largely continuous landmass into thousands of islands. Populations living in these coastal areas would have experienced this flooding within their own lifetimes, or within the memory of their immediate ancestors. The flooding was not instantaneous. It occurred over thousands of years, but within any given lifetime, the encroachment of the sea on familiar land would have been visible and vivid, and in some cases, particularly around the edges of shallow continental shelves where the slope was gentle, the flooding could have been quite rapid, perhaps fast enough to be experienced as a dramatic event rather than a gradual process. It is this period of post-glacial flooding, this 9,000-year-old transformation of the world's coastlines, that some researchers now see as the deep historical background of the world's flood myths, including the Atlantis story. Not a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged and worldwide experience of the sea claiming the land, of the familiar world being swallowed, of the memory of places that no longer exist. In this reading, Plato's Atlantis is the Greek crystallization of a human universal experience, the knowledge that the world was once different, that the sea was not always where it is now, that places where people lived are now beneath the water. Every coastal culture in the world carries some version of this memory. Plato gave the Greek version of this memory its most elaborate and enduring form. As we approach the end of our long journey through the history of Atlantis, it is worth asking where the story goes from here. What does the future of Atlantis look like? In popular culture, Atlantis shows no signs of fading. New books appear every year, new documentaries are produced, new theories are advanced on social media platforms, reaching audiences of millions with a directness that Plato and Donnelly alike would have found astonishing. The YouTube ecosystem, the very medium through which you are now listening to this story, is full of Atlantis content, from careful historical analysis to breathless conspiracy speculation. The story is alive and well. In academic scholarship, the conversation has matured considerably. Serious classicists have produced nuanced studies of the Timaeus and Critias that neither dismiss the story as simple fiction nor credulously accept it as literal history, but instead analyze it with the sophistication it deserves, as a complex philosophical text embedded in a specific historical moment, serving specific intellectual and political purposes, drawing on a wide range of cultural sources and traditions.
This is the kind of scholarly attention that reveals the real richness of Plato's achievement. In archaeology, the excavation of Akrotiri continues to yield new findings about the Bronze Age Asian world. The study of the late Bronze Age collapse has become one of the most active areas of ancient history scholarship, with new evidence constantly expanding our understanding of how and why that world fell apart. None of this work is specifically about Atlantis, but all of it illuminates the broader context in which the Atlantis story might have roots. In ocean science, the detailed mapping of the seafloor continues. Surveys of submerged continental shelves have revealed the prehistoric landscapes, valleys, lakebeds, river systems of the drowned lands at the end of the last ice age. This drowned world archaeology is a new and growing field, using technologies that barely existed a decade ago to investigate the landscapes where human beings lived before the sea claimed them. Will any of this research produce something that we could call Atlantis?
Almost certainly not in the literal sense, a sunken island empire in the Atlantic Ocean, complete with aurichalcum walls and concentric ring canals. But it may continue to deepen our understanding of the genuinely dramatic geological and climatological changes that reshaped the human world at the end of the last ice age, changes that were large enough, vivid enough, and humanly significant enough to have generated the deep mythological tradition that Plato ultimately drew on. The real Atlantis, it may be, is not a single lost city or a single sunken continent. It is the memory of a world before the floods, a world that was real, that was inhabited, that was lost not in a single day and a single night, but over thousands of years of slow, inexorable, world-changing geological transformation. That memory, distributed across every coastal culture in the world, expressed in hundreds of different flood traditions and drowned land stories, and finally crystallized by the most brilliant philosophical mind of the ancient Greek world into the most captivating lost civilization story ever told. That may be the truest thing about Atlantis. We come, at last, to what is perhaps the most important chapter in the entire history of Atlantis. Not what Atlantis was, but what it has meant, not the geology or the archaeology or the location theories, but the philosophical and cultural legacy of the story itself. Plato left us, in the Timaeus and Critias, something that is genuinely unique in the history of human thought. He created a complete imaginary civilization with a mythological origin, a geographical setting, a constitutional structure, an architectural description, a military organization, an economic basis, a history of moral development and moral decline, and a catastrophic end. And he embedded it in a philosophical dialogue as a vehicle for exploring the deepest questions about what makes a civilization good. No writer before him had done anything quite like this. Homer had described the world of Troy and the world of Odysseus's wanderings, but Homer was drawing on a tradition of oral poetry that had been developing for centuries. Herodotus had described the Persian Wars and the peoples of the known world with remarkable ethnographic detail, but he was describing real places and real people. Thucydides had analyzed the Peloponnesian War with a precision and psychological insight that has never been surpassed. But again, he was describing real events. Plato invented a civilization. He made it up, or substantially made it up, to serve a philosophical purpose. And the civilization he invented has proven more durably famous, more culturally influential, and more evocative of genuine human longing and wonder than almost any real civilization that has ever been described.
This is an extraordinary achievement. It suggests that the philosophical imagination, when it is working at the highest level, can create something that has its own kind of truth. Not factual truth, not historical truth, but mythological truth. The truth of a story that reveals something real about the human condition, even if none of the specific details are accurate. The truth that the Atlantis story reveals is this: civilization is not permanent. Greatness is not self-sustaining.
Power without virtue is self-destroying. The most dangerous enemy any civilization faces is not an external conqueror, but the internal corruption that comes from confusing prosperity for goodness, strength for wisdom, abundance for fulfillment. This is a truth that has been relevant in every era since Plato wrote it down. It was relevant in the declining years of the Roman Empire. It was relevant in the decadent courts of Renaissance Italy. It was relevant in the gilded excess of the industrial age. It is relevant now. Atlantis endures not because people are gullible or because they prefer myths to facts. It endures because the story Plato told contains a real insight, one that every generation has to rediscover for itself, in its own terms, against the backdrop of its own civilization and its own temptations. And a story that contains a real insight, told with real brilliance, told with the specific architectural and mythological and geographical richness that makes the imagination feel it is somewhere real. That story does not sink. It stays with us. It keeps returning, rising from the depths of human memory, asking us to look at ourselves. There is no muddy shallows. There is no sunken city. There is no Orishilcum wall glowing red beneath the waves. But there is Plato, and there is his question. What are we building? And are we building it right? And as long as human beings build civilizations, as long as we accumulate wealth and power and reach towards something we call greatness, that question will be with us. And in that sense, Atlantis is not lost at all. It is exactly where it has always been, right here, inside the story, inside the dream. And that, dear dreamer, is the entire history of Atlantis. From the moment those first words were set down on papyrus in the Academy of Athens, through the long centuries of debate and discovery and imagination and obsession, to the quiet moment you and I share right now with the world outside drifting through its night. From Plato's ink to Donnelly's breathless prose, from Blavatsky's visions to the silent ocean floors surveyed by modern technology, this is a story that has been held in human hands for over 2,000 years and has never been fully put down. Maybe Atlantis was real. Maybe it was a memory of something ancient and genuine, compressed and mythologized across thousands of years of retelling. Maybe it was a pure invention, spun from the mind of the greatest philosopher of the ancient world as a vehicle for his deepest moral convictions. Maybe, and this is the thought that sits most quietly in the space between sleeping and waking, it was both at once. What we know for certain is this: the desire for a better world, the grief for the beautiful things that are lost, the warning against the corruption that power brings, and the dream of an island somewhere beyond the horizon where things were once somehow right. These are not fictions. These are among the most real things in human life, and as long as they are real, Atlantis will never fully sink. May your dreams tonight be filled with the shimmer of ancient water, the glow of golden towers against a darkening sky, and the quiet certainty that some things once imagined belong to us forever. If you found peace here tonight, a like and a subscription mean the world to
into a small channel trying to keep the light on, and we will see you in the next dream. Good night.